Welcome, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight. Specifically, DBD's newest killer. Coming in from the Child's Play franchise, Charles Lee Ray, the good guy, but you can call him Chucky. Hey, remember when we were all so sure that this was going to be Predator? Yeah, there's been a lot of moments in this channel's history where I've been blessed with the gifts of prophecy, but this time really wasn't one of them. Because despite what the grid scheme for Xenomorph was setting us up for, the solo killer release for 2023 turned out to be Chucky. Something that I did not expect, and until that teaser, I don't think many of you lot did either. Coming right off the heels of the celebrated announcement that Stranger Things has returned to Dead by Daylight, Chucky hit the PTB on November the 8th. And it was the first time ever that I'd seen a license release for DBD and found myself thinking, I guess? Every other DBD licensed chapter that I've been around for on release, I've generally been pretty hyped for. Alien and Hellraiser especially are franchises that I hold very near and dear to my heart. And thus my excitement for those chapters was very high. The only real exception was Project W, which I went in with a pre-existing bias against, because Resident Evil 5 and I have a difficult history, to put it kindly. But when it comes to Child's Play, I've never had a strong opinion either way. I don't particularly like the series, but I don't dislike them either. So when I hopped on the PTB, I did so with one thought paramount in my mind. Behaviour convinced me that this is good. And I'm pleased to say, I really do think it did convince me, but for the life of me, I couldn't tell you why. My first feelings on the Chucky chapter are kind of opposite to how I felt about the Alien chapter. Not just opposite, but equal and opposite. Because while I love the Alien movies, even going so far as to defend Alien 3, Alien vs Predator and the Prometheus duology, I don't have a lot of love for the Alien chapter because to me the vibes are just off. The presentation of the Xenomorph and the images surrounding it just don't ring true with Alien's particular brand of horror, so the chapter as a whole feels pretty insincere. But with Chucky, I know this chapter just feels right. It works, it feels very authentically Chucky, even though I'm not collected enough of the franchise to fully appreciate that. So when I sat down to write this video, that's the angle I decided to look at it from. How on earth did behaviour manage to get this chapter so authentically right? How did someone so small bring us something so special? Well, a good place to start would be where I always start when trying to get the vibes of a killer expressed into words, and that's the lore. Licensed characters have an unpleasant reputation among me and the 9 other people that read DBD lore at having hands down the most undercooked stories in the game. About 2/3 of the game's licensed characters have what's effectively an excuse of lore. A few sentences vaguely explaining their presence in the fog, without any examination of them as a character at all. Maybe it'll give us a point in their timeline at which they were taken, but not really much more than that. Some licensed characters like Ash and the Ringu and Nightmare on Elm Street characters are given a bit more to work with, so that their DBD adaptation feels like an expansion of their character in their home media, rather than a regurgitation of it. But the fact that you can almost fit Leon Kennedy's entire DBD lore in one tweet should demonstrate that these are the exception, not the rule. Truth be told, Chucky's DBD lore is a lot closer to the post-it notes of the more disappointing licensed stories than the actually substantial ones. As a recap of Chucky's life in plastic, I would not say it's fantastic, but it does give us a few interesting tidbits. Before we get into them though, it's probably a good idea to talk about who Chucky is for anybody who hasn't watched these films. Naturally, this video will be full of spoilers for the Child's Play franchise, and I'd heartily recommend watching at least the first 2 films, but watching the rest of the video if you haven't done so already. Chucky, or Charles Lee Ray as he was known in life, was a serial killer known as the Lakeshore Strangler, who was caught in Chicago as he tried to escape through a toy store. He was shot and killed by Detective Mike Norris, but not before he was able to conduct a voodoo ritual to bind his soul to one of the good guy dolls in the toy store. A doll that would find its way into the ownership of a 6-year-old boy, Andy Barkley. Chucky would make Andy's life a living hell ever since, separating him from his mother Karen and forcing Andy into the foster system and then military school before reuniting with his living girlfriend Tiffany to continue his reign of terror. Throughout the years, the Chucky doll has bounced from owner to owner in one long unbroken narrative, lovingly maintained by Don Mancini, the godfather of the series, who screenwrote the first film in 1988, and still writes and produces the Chucky TV series to this day. Over the years, Chucky has become an institution of the horror landscape, existing in a similar horror comedy territory to the one Freddy Krueger occupied in the 90s, and remains one of the most immediately recognisable horror icons in the world, at least to general audiences outside of the horror community. Chucky's lore in DBD covers a relatively small part of this long fictional biography, touching on the immediate history of Chucky's life between the start of Child's Play 1 and the climax of Child's Play 2. Child's Play 2 ended one of the most memorable third act set pieces in horror history, with Andy and his foster sister Kyle squaring off with Chucky in the Good Guy doll factory. But whereas Chucky seems to meet his end in the film, DBD's canon chooses to take a different path. As Chucky staggers to his feet amidst a pile of Good Guy boxes, he sees Andy running into a thick, dark fog, a mysterious force summoned by his voodoo incantations, and one that seemingly wants to help him. As Andy runs into the fog, Chucky immediately gives pursuit, not willing to let his last chance at a human body escape him for good, and thus the entity claims Charles Lee Ray for its own. First thing I'll notice from this story is that despite his absence from the proper chapter, Andy is a major part of the story throughout, which makes sense. Chucky's rivalry with Andy is the core of the first two films after all. But there's a very good reason Andy isn't a survivor in the full chapter, because Dead by Daylight doesn't kill kids. Ever. DBD very strictly obeys laws regarding graphic violence across the world. Many of the game's mores and other violent acts would make the game very difficult to sell internationally when inflicted on literal children, and Andy's rivalry with Chucky is at its most prominent when he's a kid. To be fair, there is precedent for Andy appearing as an adult in Child's Play media. He rocks up as an adult from Curse of Chucky onwards and is still being played by Alex Vincent in the TV show today, but I think to include Andy as an adult survivor would be to miss the point a little of why Andy is important in the movie itself. And to understand why, we need to look at the source of the horror in Child's Play, a power dynamic between Chucky and his young victims. A major contributor to the tension in the Child's Play series is the sense of constant paranoia Chucky evokes among his victims. Despite his small and somewhat limiting physical form, Chucky manages to constantly render his victims absolutely powerless to stop him, and a big part of that can be found in his ability to hide in plain sight, both physically with his small size, and in terms of the power dynamic between himself and his victims. Throughout the Child's Play series, pretty much every main character aware of Chucky's true nature is either a child, suspected of mental illness, or both. And as such, Chucky is granted extreme plausible deniability by authority figures who might otherwise be able to protect people from him. Don Mancini has always shown a level of resentment towards authority figures, especially when it comes to kids, because time and again, the biggest obstacle to stopping Chucky isn't Chucky himself, but teachers, parents, or doctors just not listening to the kids in their care and often getting themselves killed before they put the pieces together. Chucky's nemesis, typically being a child or young teenager, is core to making this dynamic function properly. First it was Andy in the first three films, then it was Nika Pierce in Curse and Cult, and then Jake Wheeler and his friends in the TV show. All of these cases follow the same broad formula. Chucky takes control of their lives from them through manipulation and cruelty, but they can't do anything about it because any authority figures who might be able to help them not only won't take them seriously, but will likely start suspecting them of the crimes Chucky is committing. This generates huge amounts of tension from an antagonist who really shouldn't be taken seriously in normal circumstances, and makes us as viewers not just hate Chucky, but also resent the authority figures who take any plea for help from our young protagonists as nothing more than an admission of wrongdoing or a symptom of mental illness. Can you tell that this film, with themes of supposedly benevolent but ultimately intellectual authority figures in a time of existential terror, was written by a gay man in the 80s? Despite being pretty light on the child part of the whole Child's Play thing, DBD's iteration of Chucky manages to bring to life that paranoia that defines Chucky's relationship with his victims. The trailer for the chapter evokes this perfectly. The viewer knows that Chucky's around somewhere, but due to his small size, you don't know exactly where that is. So you just have to keep your wits about you and expect an attack from any angle, just to be sure. And his power, to some degree, pulls us off as well. Obviously, he's very small and hard to see, but you get undetectable from hidey-ho mode, and the illusory footsteps that provide the only clue to his location often leave you with false positives, causing you to be extra paranoid and unsure of his location until it's too late. Unless you're me, because when I play Survivor, I'm too brain AFK to notice the illusory footsteps anyway. You can't trick me if I'm not paying attention in the first place. Ha 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 ha! In any case, Chucky in DBD manages to evoke the paranoia of the Child's Play films in a way that feels distinct from the other paranoia-inducing killers like Michael Myers and Ghostface. He's not necessarily stealthy, but rather sneaky, if you get what I mean. He's evasive in a way that we've not really had a killer be before. And this, combined with his sheer ruthlessness, means you've always got to stay on your toes because he really could be anywhere and come at you from any angle. But if that was all Chucky was, I don't think he'd be remembered half as fondly as he is. And there's a very important element of Chucky as a character and as a franchise that we just can't forget.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Chucky has a real habit of making any workplace an unsafe work environment. Hospitals, schools, factories, even the White House. But if you find yourself injured because of your unsafe work environment, Morgan & Morgan can be right there to ensure you get the compensation you deserve and get your life back on track. If you're injured at work and don't know where to start, Morgan & Morgan make sure it's easier than ever to make those first few steps that you need to get in the compensation you're owed. Hiring a lawyer can be a daunting process, we all know that, but with Morgan & Morgan you can submit a claim without ever having to leave the couch. In 8 clicks or less, you can submit your claim to Morgan & Morgan and trust that your legal troubles are in capable hands so you can focus on your recovery and well-being. For more information, you can check out forthepeople.com or dial #key law in your phone. And on that note, let's get back to Chucky. Chucky isn't just a sneaky evil killer doll, he's a sneaky evil killer doll with a foul mouth and a wickedly dark sense of humour to match. Just as important as capturing the genuine horror that Chucky inflicts on his victims is the laughably evil nature of Mattel Myers himself. Child's Play has an interesting relationship with comedy. Whether films veer from straight-faced horror like the original Child's Play and Curse of Chucky, to horror movies with comedy elements like the second and third films, to unashamed horror comedies like Bride and Seed. It's a history of tonal experimentation that reminds me of the Evil Dead films, a series that I absolutely adore. But unfortunately I've never clicked with Chucky as much as I have with Evil Dead. Anyone who's seen the videos I've made on Ghostface or Nightmare on Elm Street will know I'm pretty selective about the horror comedy subgenre, mostly because I don't find many horror comedies to have a sense of humour that really fits with my own. I think a lot of horror comedy falls apart when the comedy winds up toning the horror down and struggling against the horror rather than working alongside it. I don't want to feel distracted by the presence of the comedy elements, and a lot of horror comedies just can't do that effectively. Side note, if you want to hear me rant about Scary Movie for a while, complaining about how it fails as a comedy and a horror movie, then please let me know. It's a video I'm tempted to make many times. Bride and Seed of Chucky are textbook examples of films struggling against themselves like these. It's not like they're awful films devoid of any merit. Jennifer Tilly's arrival as Tiffany Valentine marked a fantastic inclusion to the Chucky mythos, but the franchise as a whole taking a nosedive into comedy just didn't work for me or a lot of other Child's Play fans. But be that as it may, Chucky's comedy elements are still a core part of the character, and featuring a version of him devoid of any comedy elements at all would be kind of a betrayal of what the character became. In a lot of ways, Chucky's kind of similar to former horror comedy icon Freddy Krueger. Both of them started out in fairly serious films, before veering off into comedy directions that ultimately put the franchises into pretty poor repute. But while Nightmare on Elm Street more or less crashed and burned as New Line moved on to the Conjuring universe, Mancini and Universal never gave up on Chucky. And the reset back to fairly serious horror in Curse of Chucky led to success with Cult of Chucky in the TV show. For what it's worth, my favourite Child's Play media are the second film, Curse, and the TV show. Because Bride and Seed were way too goofy for my tastes.
How did you end up like this?
Well, it's a long story.
It sure is.
In fact, if it was a movie, it would take 3 or 4 sequels just to do it justice.
1 and 3 had some challenging scripting and direction choices that resulted in the horror being diluted by unintentionally funny moments.
But I gotta go. I have a date with a 6-year-old boy.
And Cult was trying a little bit too hard to tie the serious tone and contained story of Curse into the wider Child's Play canon. I think it created a worse and more chaotic film as a result. But regardless of my personal taste on the franchise, it's clear that Chucky's comic elements are just as important to the character and to the fans who love him as the more serious side that I can appreciate more. And so for his arrival in Dead by Daylight, he needed to be adapted with a more comic tone than the other killers for it to be truly authentic. I've got to say, the chapter really delivers. Brad Dourif's voice work is exceptional as usual. He's recorded a ton of voice lines to bring Chucky to life, not just by soullessly copy-pasting voice lines from other pieces of media for fans to soy face at, but by actually having a ton of distinct and unique voice lines that are perfectly in character for Chucky without just being rehashes. Behaviour has clearly come a long way in writing charming and fun voice lines over the years for their newcomer characters. First Nick Cage and then Chucky, and I haven't heard Jennifer Tilly's voice work yet for the Tiffany Legendary, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't just as good as Brad Dourif's reprisal for Chucky. Chucky would feel genuinely incomplete without the amazing voice work of Brad Dourif. But it really isn't the only thing that brings Chucky to life with the comedy stylings we would expect from him. The opening trailer, framed as a good guy doll advertisement, is a wonderful piece of whimsy. blending the horror and comedy elements of Chucky by juxtaposing the stereotypically cheery 80s ad style with the grisly violence and tense atmosphere of a standard DBD trailer. What a wonderful choice to play with the formula we've gotten used to over the past 7 years. The add-ons pull this off expertly too, with each and every one being a clear reference to something memorable, usually a kill by Chucky, somewhere throughout the franchise. My personal favourite has got to be the power drill though. Cult of Chucky has some really memorable gory kills, and the power drill is easily one of my favourites. Sorry Malcolm, but I think there's some surprising subtlety in Chucky's visual design animations that really make this chapter shine. Something so clever that it took me several weeks of pondering over the script to figure it out. But anybody else notice something weird about Chucky's Mori? Most DBD Moris prioritise fluid motion and visceral brutality over everything else, but Chucky's by comparison operates almost on cartoon logic, pulling objects out of hammer space at random to beat you to death with a ruler or a baseball bat or, you know, a literal hammer. The animation kind of reflects this cartoonish stylization, with Chucky's stabs and strikes feeling more jerky and obviously, well, animated than many of the other Moris, bringing to mind the limited animation and frame rates of old school slapstick cartoon violence and blending it with Chucky's trademark viciousness. Part of this I believe is down to his doll body causing him to move differently to a flesh and blood person, but regardless, the cartoonish kill is an example of what I really think makes Chucky tick from a first glance implementation perspective: his exaggerated movements. A big part of establishing identity for a character is in animation design. I've praised Pinhead to the moon and back for his coldly detached and effortlessly powerful animation design that plays on Doug Bradley's imperious and almost underacted demeanour in the role. And Chucky's animations are routinely way more exaggerated than those of most other killers. His palette break, his stun animation, and his miss slice and dice attack all feature a way bigger range of movement than most other killer animations. And this serves two purposes. The first being gameplay clarity for a killer with a small model. For a killer whose model is much smaller than the others, his movements must be bigger to compensate so they can be easily read by survivors. Expecting players to look closely at the tiny swearing ginger speck, who's more easily discernible as a moving red stain half the time, is probably a bit much to ask. But there's another reason that these animations are so exaggerated, one that to me is much more important and makes satisfying explanation for my immediate liking of Chucky. Animations that are exaggerated are just really fun to watch. Nemesis, I think, is the perfect example here. Nemesis is a massive killer who doesn't have a good reason to have animations that are exaggerated like Chucky's are. But every single thing he does is incredibly overacted and exaggerated, and it's fucking hilarious. Watching him take large steps with his large legs as he runs towards you, only to be moving just slightly faster than the survivor half his size, is just so funny. Especially when you see this giant pile of bin bags and T-Virus running across the map towards you to tunnel you off of Hook. It's just absolute comedy gold. Seriously, Nemesis is just so funny. There's a reason that his chase music has become a running joke on the channel. But it's safe to say that this humour is probably unintentional. Nemesis is meant to be a pretty serious threat, and certainly is in his home game. And part of what makes Nemesis so funny in DBD is the sheer sincerity of every absurd thing that he does. But Chucky, on the other hand, is meant to be absurd. He's supposed to be over the top and wacky and fun to watch, and the exaggerated animations really do sell that. He's a very satisfying killer to just run around with, stabbing people and making mean jokes and all that stuff, and that's completely on brand for Chucky. It captures what makes Chucky so well loved in his films, and adapts it into a game that broadly takes itself pretty seriously with animations that not only showcase the character at his best and most memorable, but also serve a valuable gameplay function. It's genuinely exceptional, and the icing on the cake is that due to his third-person camera angle, the killer gets to appreciate this too. An absolute masterstroke by Chucky's animators that brought everyone's favourite killer doll to life in the fog with a paradoxically subtle lack of subtlety. Since the first Child's Play film in 1988, Chucky's always had to exist in the middle ground between the comic and the serious, lumbering Don Mancini and the ever-growing production team behind Chucky with the unenviable task of balancing the sheer absurdity of a foul-mouthed killer Beanie Baby with the requirement to make a genuinely tense and frightening horror movie. Truth be told, it has not always succeeded, and it's made a significant number of films that I don't particularly care for, but I will always give Mancini and his team massive props for what they've been able to make over the past 35 years. From day one, Chucky's always been a family affair, with Mancini's production posse expanding with friends and family members of the cast and crew to manage the tumultuous history of Chucky with earnest love and care. Except the remake, that doesn't count. I'm pleased to say that as of today, Dead by Daylight has joined that family, and it does so with tremendous fanfare and success. When I was compiling ideas for this video, I wanted to talk about why Chucky worked so well for this adaptation to Dead by Daylight, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But as I've come to write this script and watch movie after movie and episode after episode of the show in preparation for this video, I've come to the understanding that what worked so well for this chapter is pretty much everything. Aside from maybe some more in-depth lore, I don't believe we could have gotten a better Chucky than this. Straight up, the best we could ever have received for this chapter. And let's not forget, a lot of people, myself included, had largely written Chucky off as a potential killer due to his small size. But behaviour have really proven the doubters wrong by delivering what is arguably their most authentic and charming integration of any licensed killer to date. And the fact that I can say this with such certainty, despite not being hugely fond of the power or of the franchise, is a testament to how thoroughly I believe they've done a good job. And they've done well enough to impress me, Captain Cynical, then I can only begin to imagine how happy the people for whom Child's Play was their dream license are right now. You guys have been waiting for so damn long, and I'm really pleased for you that you finally got what you wanted, and got it in such a spectacular fashion too. It was never really going to be my chapter anyway, so I don't mind that it's not really my thing. That's been the status for most of the past 2 years anyway, and we just got new Skull Merchants, so at least I'm not bored right now. So, boys, girls, and everything else, happy Chucky Day, and remember everybody, play nice. Well, that's everything I have to say about a certain angry little ginger thing. Hope you enjoy watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I've got some exciting plans for December, so if you want to keep on track with them, then do feel free to subscribe and the little notification bell so that you always know when I'm uploading. Next video is going to be talking about the Black Veil Entity Cult, so if that's the kind of thing you'll be interested in, then be sure not to miss out. If you want to get it extra early, then you can hop on my Patreon, because patrons get to see my videos a day in advance and get a bunch of other sweet perks. So if you're at all interested in throwing a couple of doubloons my way, then that would be much appreciated. The link is in the description. I guess I'll see you in the next video. Ta-ta for now.